20 years ago today, on April 19th, 1995, Oklahoma City experienced the greatest act of domestic terrorism in American history, and 168 lives were lost. Hundreds more were injured and permanently scarred by the experience. The state rallied, the city rallied, and the country rallied around those victims, and they performed an extraordinary act of rescue and recovery. As we pause on this 20th anniversary to remember the lives that were lost, we should also celebrate the heroism that was exhibited. First responders, not knowing what they would find, not knowing if there would be a second blast, raced to the scene of the disaster and immediately began to recover lives and save people and, frankly, recover bodies as well. But it was more than just Oklahoma City could handle. And of course, the communities in the immediate surrounding areas immediately pitched in. We had other fire departments, other police departments come to the scene. The Oklahoma National Guard was mobilized. But this was a disaster beyond the means of even the state of Oklahoma to deal with. And it's at times like that you recognize how fortunate you are to be an American. Within hours, all the resources, all the compassion of a generous and great people were available to help us through a difficult time in Oklahoma. We had rescue teams from literally every part of the country arrive, an endless supply of federal resources, and of course law enforcement who ultimately identified the perpetrators of the crime and brought them to justice. It was a harrowing moment in the history of our state, and it could have been a moment in which we broke. But quite frankly, it was a moment where we found our strength and we found our voice. We found it first in the families of the extraordinary people that were victims of the terrible act of terror. They rallied, they hung together as families do, they helped, they had friends and neighbors who helped them, and they were an example to all the world, frankly, of the strength and the decency and the resilience of the American people. And around them, we had wonderful public leadership. Frank Keating was the governor of our state at that critical moment. I can't think of a person who would have been better prepared to handle such a tragedy. A former FBI agent, former Tulsa prosecutor, former U.S. attorney, former Associate Attorney General of the United States. Frank Keating knew the face of terror, having investigated it in the 1960s as a young FBI agent on the West Coast. But more than knowing terror, he knew how to lead, and he knew instantly what had happened. He immediately took charge of the situation, and he directed every resource at his disposal to help those in need. We also had wonderful local leadership at the time. Mayor of Oklahoma City, Ron Norick, showed all the same sorts of leadership capabilities and compassion that our governor exhibited at a moment of crisis. Ron Norick is one of the great unknown, unsung public leaders in America. On 9/11, all of America saw Rudy Giuliani perform heroically in New York City, and he was dubbed America's mayor. Frankly, Ron Norick, on April 19th of 1995, was also America's mayor. He dealt with a totally unanticipated situation, and he did so not only with ability, but with compassion and courage and energy. Remarkable performance. I also think, frankly, of Kathy Keating, because when we were dealing with this horrific situation, she saw beyond the moment and recognized that the state and the country needed to grieve, needed to have a moment in which you could honor those who had been lost and honor those who had worked heroically to save the wounded. On the second night after the disaster, she actually came to a meeting at the governor's mansion when we were working still on rescue and recovery, wondering whether or not there were still people alive in the building, and said we needed to have a ceremony on the following Sunday to recognize the event. I remember being almost overwhelmed by what we were dealing with and thinking, how in the world can we ever pull off something like this? Kathy Keating took charge. She said, don't worry, I know everybody here's busy, I'll put it together. And put it together she did. Within a matter of days, the President of the United States, the Governor of the state of Oklahoma, Billy Graham, and literally thousands of Oklahomans gathered in Oklahoma City to honor those who had been lost and to express their support and appreciation for those who continued to work on the scene as we recovered bodies and, frankly, assessed damage. So again, a remarkable act of heroism. And finally, my friend and colleague Frank Lucas was absolutely indispensable in dealing with the tragedy. You know, Frank's district office was literally in the next building over from the Murrah building where the damage and the bombing had occurred. And we wondered for several hours whether or not his own staff was all right. But once we got through the tragedy, we needed help from Washington, D.C., help in rebuilding Oklahoma City. And there were lots of barriers in the way. Frankly, there are provisions in the law that require states and localities in natural disasters to pay for 25% of the recovery effort. Our argument was that this wasn't a natural disaster. It was an attack on a federal facility, and that the federal government needed to be there to help. Frankly, we had both a willing partner in President Clinton and his administration, and we had Frank Lucas going to bat for us on Capitol Hill, making sure that the laws were changed, that regulations were adjusted to the reality of a terrorist attack, and that the resources were available for the long-term reconstruction of downtown Oklahoma City. There are literally dozens of more people that I could go through and name that played significant roles, first in dealing with the disaster and then in the long recovery. But at the end of the day, the people that deserve the praise the most are simply the citizens of Oklahoma. They acted the way you hope people will act in a dangerous and desperate situation. They not only provided leadership, they provided support and compassion, and they assisted in every way possible throughout the terrible tragedy. And again, our fellow Americans deserve plaudits as well, because they were with us each and every step of the way. Through the efforts and support of the administration led by President Clinton, but frankly through their prayers, through their thoughts, through their generous donations and gifts to the survivors and to the foundation that saw to the education of those who lost parents in the terrible disaster. Americans are a remarkably strong, decent, and compassionate people. And you're very fortunate, if you're in a disaster, to have their full support, which we certainly had in Oklahoma City. So on this, the 20th anniversary of this terrible tragedy, we have a moment of triumph as well, because this was a case where evil did not overcome good, where decency prevailed over terror, where compassion was readily available, and where the people of the United States, and most particularly the people of Oklahoma City, demonstrated to the world that they would never be terrorized, never be humbled, would always be proud, and would always respond with compassion and courage when confronted with danger and disaster. So let's pause, honor those we lost, honor those who performed so well, and be grateful for the fact that we live in the greatest, the freest, and the most compassionate country in the world. I'm Tom Cole. I'm proud to share these reflections with you. Good luck and God bless.